My name is John Gershman. I'm from the NYU Wagner School and the New York Southeast Asia Network, and jointly with the Columbia Journalism School and Berkeley's Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies. We're very happy to welcome you to the webinar today. Excuse me. We're going to ask people as we go along, if you have questions, to please throw them in the Q&A portion, and in the second half of the webinar, I'll moderate some of those questions to our speakers. And so let me introduce our two panelists, and then we'll be off to the races. So Lisandro Liloy Claudio is an assistant professor of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, go Bears, and host of Basagan on Trip, and also the author of a book of the same title. Sheila Coronel is the director of the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism at Columbia University and a co-founder of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. She was author also of a recent piece in The Atlantic, from which we plagiarized the topic or the title of this webinar, around how democracy dies. So thank you both for joining us today. I'm wondering if we can start before we go into the deep nitty-gritty. President Duterte gave his State of the Nation address the other day. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about what you thought about that, anything that was surprising, and yeah, just your general reaction. Sheila, maybe we can start with you.
Well, definitely, President Duterte remains very much on message. This SONA has the same tone and the same content as his first State of the Nation address in 2016. And one reason I think why he's a successful communicator is that he sticks to very broad, clear messages that he keeps repeating and repeating again. And those messages in the SONA are the same ones. First is, a punitive approach to drugs, crime, dissent, and this time also quarantine violators. And second is his whole anti-oligarchy, anti-elite rhetoric, singling out especially the so-called yellow elites, ABS-CBN, the Ayalas of Globe, Manny Pangilinan. So he's very much sticking to the same message that he's been pounding and communicating since he became president, or actually since his presidential campaign.
Liloy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to add that I think there's a sense of desperation now in Duterte. Oh, sorry, my video. You can sense the desperation in the speech because he only has 2 years left and he wants to get a lot of things done. First thing he wants to get done is he wants to pave the way for a new oligarchy that's more loyal to him. So that's what's happening in the telecom industry. So significant part of the speech was him criticizing the two big telco, the duopoly of Smart and Globe. Essentially, what he wants to do there is he wants to discredit these two institutions or these two companies, and he wants to pave the way for the emergence of a third telco, which will probably be run by somebody who's more supportive of Duterte. And of course, he talked about ABS-CBN as well. The interesting thing about his discussion of ABS-CBN was, if you remember, his press secretary, Harry Roque, said that he had nothing to do, the president had nothing to do with the closure of the ABS-CBN. And yet Duterte contradicts his own press secretary by talking about how his targeting of ABS-CBN was a function, was largely because ABS-CBN had violated his rights as a candidate, and also because he wanted to take down the Lopez segment of the oligarchy. And then finally, the last interesting thing I detected in the SONA was his targeting of Senator Frank Drilon. I don't think he's going to jail Franklin Drilon, although you never know. But I think the reason why he was targeting Drilon was because Drilon was going after Sara Duterte. And President Duterte is very wary of people who go after Sara Duterte, because obviously I think what's becoming clear now is that he wants to anoint Sara Duterte as the next president so that Sara can shield him from possible prosecution. So those are the signs of desperation. There are 2 years left. Having said that, he's probably still popular. We don't know, but I think that once the survey companies are able to conduct surveys again, the lowest he'll get is in the 60s, I think.
So Sheila, Liloy mentioned the ABS-CBN issues, and kind of the Duterte administration's attack on the media has been again, another constant throughout his presidency. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the most recent things that in part animated your Atlantic piece, and kind of what do you think we might see kind of moving forward?
First of all, the shutdown of ABS-CBN accomplishes two things. One is it defangs the largest broadcaster in the country, whose loyalties to Duterte have always been suspect. And then second, it reinforces the anti-oligarchy message. But beyond that, the Duterte agenda is really to clamp down on free speech and to clamp down on dissent, and to clamp down on the amplifiers of independent and accountability reporting. So he's basically clamping down on institutions of accountability, and the media is definitely one of the major institutions of accountability. And in the media, the ones that stand out have been, Rappler for sure, which has been the target of multiple lawsuits. And as we know, last month, Maria Ressa and the author of this piece, Reynaldo Santos, were sentenced to jail term of anywhere from 6 months to 6 years, but that's not the end of it. Last week, Maria had another cyber libel suit filed by the same person. They have suits for tax evasion, for violations of the ban on foreign ownership of the media. So there has been almost since 2016 an unrelenting attack on independent media or the non-Duterte controlled media. And it's really part of a broader toolkit, if you can call it that, of media repression, which includes not just legal and regulatory measures of the sort that have been used against ABS and Rappler, but also the unleashing of a whole disinformation and troll army against independent journalists and independent media organizations, and basically against independent critics or against and also the opposition. So, and the goal of that is really to delegitimize and demonize the media, paint them as agents of the elite or as purveyors of fake news, thereby having them lose their credibility before the people. So the power of the media is the power of amplification. Especially if you have a national broadcaster like ABS-CBN, which reaches throughout the country. You can argue that Rappler reaches mainly the urban English-speaking readership, mostly young, mostly politically conscious. It is sort of the democracy constituency, if you can call it broadly, civil society, students, people who are part of political parties and are politically active. But ABS-CBN really reaches the masses. So by denying independent voices the power of amplification, Duterte is basically consolidating his control over public discourse in the Philippines. Both ways, by clamping down on independent media and also by drowning information space with disinformation and propaganda. It's not like anything we've seen before, when mostly it was just the use of regulatory mechanisms or legal mechanisms to suppress the press, but not this kind of flooding of the information space with disinformation and fake news and propaganda.
Leela, one of the other developments that happened recently, kind of coterminous with the recent court cases against, or the findings against Maria Ressa and the seizure of the newspapers, was the signing of the anti-terror legislation. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that dimension of kind of an attack on dissent and space for legitimate dissent.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so whatever I say is just based on the input of lawyers as to the legal provisions. There are three that are concerning. The first, of course, is the expanded definition of terrorism. The second is the capacity of the government to arrest people without charging them. They've expanded the time they're allowed to do that. And then the third is that the definition of terrorism will be implemented or will be interpreted by this anti-terror council that is under the president. That's the most concerning part. I asked a friend who's Glenn Tuazon, who's a law student at NYU, and he thinks that's the worst part of it. And this just dovetails with what Senator Risa Ontiveros said when they were discussing the bill in the Senate. She said that the way you should look at this bill is that you should assume that it's being implemented by the most malevolent government possible. And I think, you know, when she said that, she was probably not speaking in hypotheticals. This is probably already the most malevolent government possible. So that's the legal part. When it comes to the political part of the anti-terror bill, I think one of the things that isn't being talked about too much is that this is essentially Duterte's way of placating the military. I think Sheila's mentioned this, Glenda Gloria's also mentioned this. Because if you remember, during the early part of the Duterte administration, he had appointees who were essentially nominated by the Communist Party of the Philippines in the cabinet. And that really ticked off the military. So what he's trying to do now is he's trying to backpedal because he needs the support of the military. And the anti-terror legislation is his way of making it up to the military. And so let's be clear, while this bill can target anyone, it can target me, it can target journalists, the primary target of this bill, at least in the minds of those who crafted it, are the above ground organizations of the Communist Party of the Philippines. And they're the ones who are going to be subject to brutal repression at this point.
I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit in terms of trying to understand why he would make a shift from having a kind of informal de facto alliance with at least a segment, a wing of the left, or part of the Communist Party early in the administration, as opposed to that shift and now effectively criminalizing some of those same people and organizations who used to be in his government.
I think these two institutions were essentially initially trying to use each other. So Duterte was trying to use them in order to create a semblance of him being a progressive candidate. On the other hand, at least the military wing of the CPP-NPA liked the fact that while they were in alliance with Duterte, that there was an opportunity to at least rest their troops or even expand some of their recruitment processes in the countryside. So, you know, the jury's still out on as to whether or not it was good for the NPA. I didn't really see New People's Army. I don't really think that there was they expanded their troop count as a result of the alliance. So I think Duterte got the better of them. And now, you know, his rhetoric probably now is, you know, I gave you a chance. The peace process collapsed. I'm going to go after you now. Mm-hmm. And that's probably what he's telling the military as well. So you know, the anti-terror bill is just the first part of that. I forgot to mention earlier, John, that, you know, if you look at the Senate hearings, a lot of the Senate hearings in 2019, these were essentially, a lot of them were run by Bato de la Rosa, the architect of the drug war, and really one of Duterte's most loyal allies in the Senate. And a lot of them were essentially McCarthyite hearings, wherein de la Rosa was talking about communist recruitment in the universities and also among farmers. So it was obvious, the rhetoric was obvious. They were building up towards essentially a kind of anti-communist law. And that's what this is. This is what the anti-terror bill is.
Thanks. Sheila, you've been covering and have been involved in the release of a major report on drug war killings and have written a number of articles that discuss it. What have we, you know, how has now 4 years into the Duterte administration, do we see anything different in the drug war? Has the kind of repressive strategy simply shifted from the drug war to enforcing the quarantine? Kind of where are we in that process?
Well, the police is Duterte's enforcer, right? So whatever Duterte sees are the problems of the country, the police are called in. So the police are the enforcer of the punisher, if you can call it that. And the police were called on to be the front lines of the drug war, where thousands have been killed, as you know. And now we have a pandemic. So you can argue that both COVID-19 and drug addiction are public health problems, not policing problems. And yet what Duterte has done is to conflate both as a problem of a lack of discipline on the part, especially of poor communities, and that therefore what you need to do is enforce the law. That he's basically arguing that the reason for the spread of COVID-19 is that people are not quarantining. And so the police like numbers, and The police have always had this metrics. It's the police everywhere like numbers. And so right now, since March 15, I think there have been something like more than 250,000 people have been cited for violations, and about nearly 80,000 people who've been arrested for violations of the quarantine. That's like a great number, but the police like that. They like the body count, whether it's a body count of arrests and everything. But much more fundamentally, I think what this shows is that Duterte is reinforcing a very classist view of Philippine society, that the poorest and most marginalized sectors of society are also criminals. So he is systematically criminalizing the poor, whether they are drug users or quarantine violators or vectors of disease. And his tool for doing so have been the police, of course, with the cooperation of Congress and social media and other sectors who've been reinforcing the messaging. But basically, even from his days as Davao mayor, Duterte has always thought of, slum areas as places that are vectors of terrorism, insurgency, crime, and now also of disease and infection. And so this is a worldview that has really characterized his policies, both as mayor and as president. And as mayor, he has used the police to go after the poorest sectors of Davao City. And he's basically doing that on a much larger scale from Davao to the rest of the country. So also, it should be noted that the same communities that have been terrorized by the drug war are the same communities now being terrorized by these very extreme lockdown measures. I mean, one of the survivors of the drug war I've been in touch with over periods of has just been sending me Facebook photos that show in her neighborhood in Metro Manila, tanks and police in camouflage uniform patrolling the streets looking for lockdown violators. So, as they say, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So to the police, every chance they get to crack down and use policing methods, including not just arrest and if necessary killing, but also surveillance. There's massive surveillance now in neighborhoods. First, it was supposedly to root out drug users, but now it's really surveillance on who is sick, who has COVID-19, who's violating the quarantine. So in effect, we have sort of a police state without, that's what we are. It's the Philippines is under the mercy of the police and of a president who has relied on the police to stay and consolidate power.
So I was wondering if you could make a comment. A lot of people have made, or some people have made analogies between kind of Duterte and the Marcos era, similarities and differences, particularly when, the controversy about whether, burying Marcos in the cemetery for heroes and so forth. Do you see, so and other people have argued that Duterte is kind of a sui generis, kind of fascistic politician. How would you compare their, at some level, Marcos would have, given a body part to be able to kill political enemies and have the level of popularity that Duterte has. So I'm curious how you think about him with respect to Marcos.
Should I take the first crack at it and maybe Leloy can follow? So back in 2017, Walden Bello wrote a piece that said Duterte is a fascist original because unlike Marcos with his creeping authoritarianism, Duterte opened, even before his first day in office, there were these dead bodies on the street. So he said that was original. I don't think so. I think Duterte is a second-rate copy of Marcos. I mean, his stance on the oligarchy, his clamping down of dissent, his distrust of civil society, even his anti-elite, anti-oligarch rhetoric is very, very Marcosian. And it is no secret that the Marcoses and the Dutertes are political allies. And one of the, sort of exchanges that were agreed upon for that alliance was that Marcos would be granted, finally, after 30 years, a hero's burial, what's left of him anyway, granted a hero's burial in the hero's cemetery. And that was one of the first things that Duterte did when he was president. And up to now, the Marcoses are very close to the Dutertes. So the difference, and Lelo can extrapolate on this, is that Marcos had technocrats. He had, he had some of the, he had sort of an ideology, and some of the big public intellectuals of that time justifying sort of his revolution from the center. Duterte is bereft of kind of like that kind of expertise. I mean, his government cannot even implement the social remediation program in an effective way, cannot even control a pandemic. So he does not have the effectiveness. So when he said, when Filipinos are being asked to trade off their freedoms, I don't know what we're trading it for. Certainly it's not for efficient government.
There is one difference, and this is the difference that historian Vicente Rafael points out, and that's that Duterte is not concerned with the trappings of bourgeois rhetoric. He doesn't care if he looks fancy or not. And of course, the two previous strongmen in the Philippines, Marcos and Quezon, they at the very least were like your typical bourgeois politicians, or they presented themselves that way. So there's a rhetorical difference. But I do want to talk about the difference between the technocrats of Marcos and the people who are running Duterte's administration. Last week, I just interviewed one of the lead technocrats of Marcos, former Prime Minister Cesar Virata, and I asked him why Marcos was so willing to spend. So Marcos was a big spender. And of course, spending in the Philippines, especially in the 70s, was inflationary, created debts, and a lot of that spending was triggering protests. And Virata couldn't answer the question because he's essentially a technocrat. But what I gathered from reading between the lines was essentially because he was a dictator, he didn't care, so he just kept spending. Duterte is a dictator, but he's not even using the power of dictatorship, the power of his influence, in a manner that will get us out of this, in a manner that will get us out of the hole that is COVID. So if you look at, for example, the way his technocrats have been reacting to the COVID crisis, they don't want to spend. There's a bill in Congress right now called the Arise Bill, and it's proof. It's number one. It's proof that the Philippines might be more functional than the United States at this moment, because it was actually a bill written by Congressperson Stella Kimbo, and she's an enemy of Duterte. At least a lot of the Duterte people think she is, and yet the bill got support, widespread support from the other members of the House of Representatives. And when the finance department of Duterte saw that bill, they said, we don't have the money for it. Essentially, they don't want to borrow. So that aversion to borrowing, that fear that they will be downgraded by the creditors because they borrowed more, is not Marcosian. In fact, it's more akin to the contemporary version of neoliberalism that a lot of people have seen from the 80s onwards. And this is really disconcerting, because if you look at all the indicators, whether it's per capita spending, whether it's percentage of GDP, whether it's total amount of money spent, our COVID relief effort has been one of the lowest in Asia and Southeast Asia.
I'm curious, and this also draws from one of the questions that people wrote in. So at this point, how much do we attribute kind of the Duterte's attacks on democracy as kind of a Duterte agenda, or the agenda of a broader coalition for which he is kind of the spokesperson? Is it, is he a reflection of a group that really has a transformational vision of the Philippines, which includes criminalizing, poor working class folks, and, having a transformational vision with respect to the economy? Or is this really, this is an expression of his personal agenda? I'd throw it.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was gonna pass it on to Sheila, but she passed it on first. I think this is difficult. On the one hand, I think the agenda is really, at least in the mind of his followers, to look at the Davao model and to see and to assess whether or not it works in the rest works for the entire country. And now it's obvious that it doesn't. So, you know, people, I've been watching a lot of Seth Meyers recently, and he's gotten to a point where he just says that the problem with the Donald Trump administration is that it is intellectually and morally bankrupt. People don't talk about Duterte in those terms in the Philippines. But I think if you can say that Trump agenda is intellectually and morally bankrupt, then you should say that about the Duterte agenda as well, because the Duterte agenda is an agenda of mass murder. And this is not something we should approach from a both sides perspective. You don't treat Duterte like a normal president. And this applies to journalists, this applies to academics. So for example, you know, a lot of people will say, you know, you don't approach politics from the perspective of good versus evil. I agree. Normally, yes. Normally, there are complexities. But this is not complex. This is really evil. Mass murder is evil. So if I go on my moral high ground and say, you know, there's something fundamentally wrong and you're you're immoral if you support that agenda, that's because it's clearly immoral. And at this point, the perspective we should take is, you know, we shouldn't just put our academic and journalistic hats on. We should put on the hats of citizens and human beings, because these are crimes against humanity. And so it challenges us to engage the Philippines from the perspective of human beings.
Laloy, that means most of Congress is immoral and heartless, because really Duterte has the majority. Duterte is not a sole agent. He does have support, and he does represent something, maybe something malevolent, but something that is real and very deeply rooted in the Philippines. And this is, you know, first you have this, maybe the kindest term I can call them is these illiberal elites who want to have control of the state in order to keep plundering the treasury and the country. And we've had a whole history of that, but Duterte has around him a coalition of those illiberal elites who are benefiting both in power, you know, both in Congress and in the cabinet, and outside, businessmen who have profited from this government. So there clearly are financial and economic interests behind Duterte. There are also political interests, you know, people who hope to succeed him or hope to have a position, you know, the Alan Cayetanos of the world, hope to have a place in the, not just in this regime, but in the next one. And so they are coalescing around him. And then there are the Marcoses who remain, you know, with their money and their social media power, and still, you know, the remaining allure of their name have been very, very supportive of Duterte. So he does have support of a section of the elite that has money and power and wants more, right? And wants to take over the money and power that others have wielded for decades and for centuries. So there is that, but also he has the police, which has gotten more money, more power, more resources, and are operating with impunity now. In the past, you know, if you live in a gated neighborhood, you could at least rely on, you know, your own police. But right now, the police are much like the military during the Marcos time. Being rich, middle class, educated, English speaking will no longer protect you against the police. They have become extremely powerful, and they are, you know, sort of the largest armed group, and then a very big. If you look at the officers who are implementing the pandemic, who are in the interagency task force, a lot of them are police generals. So there are clearly people benefiting from this regime and have a stake in supporting it and seeing some sort of successor regime to be in power. And that goes all the way to local governments and local officials who have benefited from the largesse of the national government. So, but apart from that, I think the anti-poor rhetoric and the anti-crime rhetoric still resonates among many Filipinos, including poor Filipinos. And Duterte has been very good at using this rhetoric in order to get support. How popular he is, I think there is a question. I don't know, because there have been no polls conducted since the pandemic, but maybe Lelo, you have a guess.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, like before the last survey, Pulsation survey, December 2019, he was 87%. So let's say that after the pandemic, and this might be the worst case scenario, that his popularity drops by 30%. That's still 57%. That's still a majority of the country. And that's still way higher than somebody like Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro, for instance. So, even if he drops, he's still going to be extremely popular.
Let me also add that Duterte benefits from this global populist moment, just as Marcos did in the 1970s, which was a global sort of strongman moment. And because there are questions here about China. So in the past, people like Marcos or even Gloria Arroyo, or people who were, conscious about the US and its power and the importance of keeping close ties with the US, there was some sort of hindrance to human rights violations and clamping down in the opposition and on civil liberties. But Duterte has hitched his wagon to China, where human rights concerns are not primary. And he's been relying on China for infrastructure support, for help in the pandemic. China is now the savior in the same way that US was the savior in the past. And so he has managed to pivot the Philippines towards China. And one of the sources of his strength and support is really China, Chinese state support, Chinese investments, Chinese tourists, Chinese online gamblers, well, until the recent pandemic, of course. But it also shields him from criticism from the Western alliance about his democratic and human rights record.
I wonder if we could just pick up in your last point before we come back to the kind of the puzzle of Duterte's popularity, although in recent months, as you pointed out, we don't know, is it seems to me that Duterte played this very ambivalent game with the United States, right? Kind of at some level, certainly been the most anti-US president in rhetorical terms, but when push comes to shove, seems to be eminently pragmatic in terms of not necessarily having the most extreme elements of the rhetoric actually taking place and being willing. And is that kind of an outcome of kind of lobbying by the military, who are reluctant to kind of totally cut ties with their biggest benefactor? Kind of what has been the elements of that? Certainly the administration is not afraid, whether under Obama or under Trump, of kind of human rights rhetoric from the United States. But I'm just curious on that, of how, because it seems like the military would be the largest single kind of stakeholder within the administration that would be uncomfortable with a more severe cut in ties with the US.
Yeah, I think so. I think Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana can be categorized as a kind of normal defense secretary, in the same way that Finance Secretary Sonny Dominguez can be categorized as a normal finance secretary. So these are not the populist wings of the administration. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that the US is also not aggressive in terms of its dealings with Duterte. So for example, Maria got arrested. Maria is actually a US citizen. And the only response you get from the State Department was essentially a tweet, something that could be condensed in a tweet, that they were showing concern. I'd like to think that had there been a Hillary Clinton presidency, that there would have been a longer, more strident message from the State Department.
Yeah, I think there's clearly no doubt that Clinton and presidency would have had a different, at least rhetorical position on that front.
But you're right, John. Oh, sorry, but you're right about the military being unhappy about, the failure to, just guard our territorial boundaries. It's sort of a source of wounded military pride. Mm-hmm. So I think Duterte's way of assuaging them is by saying, let's go after the communists. Mm-hmm. Giving them back to their original mandate, which is to go against homegrown terrorism rather than defending the borders. In the past, we had, the Philippines had the US to defend its borders, and so the Philippine military would. So now he's trying to divert them and giving them a sop by giving them the anti-terror bill and the power to go against the communists.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, and now we're drawing more explicitly from some of the questions that people have posted, and people should feel free to continue to post. At various points during the administration, there seemed to be some efforts by Duterte to advance a constitutional reform agenda, either to institutionalize himself in power or to create space for his daughter, or just fundamental political reforms. I'm wondering if you see any likelihood of a substantial effort at charter change in the last couple of years of the administration, and what the parameters of that might look like.
Can Sheila take that?
Okay, so
Okay.
almost every president since Marcos, actually Marcos also did constitutional change, has attempted to change the constitution in order to allow them to go beyond the term limits. Far more effective presidents failed to do this. So I doubt that Duterte would. I mean, his understanding of, say, federalism is very fuzzy, and I don't think he really understands that. So even as he says he's doing it, and he threatens to do it, I don't think that his party, despite having a craven Congress, would be able to do it.
No, I think the Senate already said it's going to be dead on arrival. They say it again and again. So, last month, for example, there was a push towards charter change again. And then he didn't mention it in the SONA. Instead, he started defending Sara from Senator Drilon. So it's clear to me that what's happening now is a kind of pivot. Instead of charter change, put all your eggs in the Sara Duterte basket.
The Duterte's strength is his unpredictability, so that you don't know what his next move is going to be. So there are those saying that he will do like what he did in Davao, when, to escape term limits, he ran as vice mayor to Sara Duterte, and then, then became mayor, so in de facto mayor. So that's what people are saying he's going to do again this time. But you never really know with Duterte. Part of the way he's able to retain control is his ability to surprise you and be unpredictable. And also, you never know what the limits are in terms of what he can do, of what you can do, or what he can do, much like the Communist Party in China. You never know what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so you're constantly on your toes. And this is what Duterte is doing. He's basically messing with the minds of the opposition and of the people. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can, comes from one of the questions, talk a little bit about, so where are the kind of pro-democratic forces in this whole process? So, from the imprisonment of, Senator De Lima, to the attacks on the press, to the passage of the anti-terror legislation, to the massacres of, tens of thousands of people, do you see, or where is what would, arguably be the kind of pro-democratic constituency that would be rising up to defend Philippine democracy against these consistent assaults?
Yeah, I think what you're getting is something very similar to the Marcos opposition, in the sense that you have like alliances between liberals, social democrats, and Maoists. And this is obviously quite different from the situation 3 years ago, because 3 years ago, I remember we had an event in Colombia, and Father Bert, the Jesuit priest who looks after whistleblowers, was essentially begging the hard left to join us in the streets because they weren't there. So the nice thing is that, of course, that after they got kicked out of the Duterte administration, the opposition is now significantly broader. Although one would have wished that they would have joined us sooner, but I'm happy they're there now. So it's that, and it's also like a generation of youth activists who have only faced such a deep, who have only now faced a political crisis this deep, and so we'll figure out how they do. Because like for people in their 20s, what's the worst political crisis they went through? GMA, and they were still too young at that rate. So let's see how they do. Let's see how they fare given this conjuncture.
And what do you see coalescing around is this primarily a protest kind of, like, where would you expect to see, of course, in the pandemic, it's much harder to kind of organize kind of popular protest, but where would you expect to see efforts that would be, trying to lay the foundation for not just defending against further erosion of democratic principles and institutions in the last 2 years, but building an alternative vision for a different candidate in the next election?
I just add a little bit before. Do you have something to say, Sheila? I just have one quick add-on. It's of course de facto now is really going to be. It seems like Leni Robredo is de facto the leader of opposition, and no other name has emerged. But the interesting thing about Philippine politics is that a year before the election, something could happen, and there could be someone else. So you never know who's going to be president. These things are decided down the wire. But I think it's very important that in terms of strategy, that the opposition coalesce around an electoral strategy, because the way Dutertismo survives is Duterte gets to anoint a successor. And this is probably the only weakness, the biggest weakness in Dutertismo, that Duterte's charisma is not easy to pass on. And there's no clear heir. Sara has some of it, but there are other people who will contest, kind of like being heirs to Duterte, Cayetano for one. So that division that's inherent in the Duterte system, that's something that can be exploited by the opposition.
Sheila, did you want to?
No, I just say that Filipinos have always tended to vote for somebody very different from the previous president. And that's historically from Marcos been the case. So maybe this time that's going to be the case as well. And as Lela said, the split, if the opposition is weak, but Duterte and his allies are also, there's cleavages and forces at war within to see who's going to emerge dominant. So we will have to see. But I think if you're talking about Leni Robredo, I think what you can see here is that in terms of language, rhetoric, and style, Duterte still projects very much this iron-fisted machismo style. What Leni is trying to do, very much like what Cory did in 1986, is try and project a more compassionate, more sort of female energy, and much more the language of caring to contrast against. So let's see what kind, and the church is doing the same thing. Because I'm trying to see what sort of language or narrative can counter Duterte's narrative. And so far, the one that's emerging is a language and narrative of care, compassion. Let's do something for the poor, for the victims. Let's something more uniting, someone more more solidifying and much more appealing to I'd say Catholic charitable sort of sentiments than. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see how far this language goes.
One of the questions came out that, so one of the strategies for accountability has been to document the killings and so forth and kind of create an evidentiary base or a portfolio for some kind of post-administration accountability, right? Either domestically or potentially an ICC case. I'm just curious, this comes from the questions of how likely do you see there being some kind of post-administration accountability, either international or domestic?
I think Sheila knows more about that than I do.
So there have already been sanctions against General De La Rosa and a few other police officers for human rights violations. Certainly, I think sanctions, Magnitsky Act kind of actions against police officers and military officers, as well as police units implicated in extrajudicial killings. That's already happening. Locally, I think it's very hard under this administration to think that there's going to be accountability. And one of the pressures on Duterte to appoint a successor, or to anoint a successor and ensure that successor's victory, is the worry that his successor will go after him, as previous presidents have done with their predecessors. ICC, I don't know what's happening. They're investigating. Maybe they will come out. Maybe the think a lot of human rights groups are hoping they will launch an official investigation, and we'll see how that goes. But the ICC takes a long time. Whether ICC arrests warrants, for example, will be respected or be served by the police, it's another matter. But certainly, I think there's a lot of nervousness among police officers, especially now they can't travel, and I know that a lot of their families are worried that they cannot come to the U.S. So there's some sort of sanction, but clearly not enough.
Lilo, did you have anything to add?
No, nothing much, but just wanted to emphasize that, of course, the implication here is you need to come up with an electoral strategy, because if Duterte is able to anoint his successor, then there's no justice.
One of the things that also seemed to distinguish Duterte from Marcos, perhaps, were the scale of rhetorical assaults on the Catholic Church, certainly during his campaign and once since in office. And I'm curious, and the Catholic Church played a central role to kind of protect and incubate kind of anti-Marcos, pro-democracy, human rights work during the Marcos era. How do you think about the role of the church? Is the church fundamentally weaker now than it was during the Marcos era? Has there, there's a narrative of Catholic charity and justice, but there's also another narrative which is, drug addiction is a sign of sin, and there's that kind of narrative. So curious where you see the kind of the church in this particular moment.
I think Duterte knew early on that the church was rhetorically weak. And that's because of the debate that happened over the reproductive health care law under the Aquino administration, where the church showed, frankly, some amount of hypocrisy and essentially a disdain for women's rights. So the church took a big hit there, and Duterte used that. And that's why a lot of his anti-church attacks resonated, because there was already exasperation over the church. So that was very strategic. Having said that, the church is emerging as very clear moral voice at this point. It's the kind of moral voice that we need. And you get people like, for example, Bishop Ambo David, Bishop Pabilio, Brother Armin Luistro, and these are Father Bert Alejo. These are the kinds of clear moral voices that we need now, not the voices that equivocate. So, I'm not a Catholic, and I'm very wary of Catholic moralism, but I think my Catholic schoolboy roots are starting to manifest now, because I think what's very clear now is the need for unequivocal moral response.
So let me just say that what Duterte is attacking, or who Duterte is attacking, is the people power constituency, which consists of the church, especially the church hierarchy, the bishops, the Makati Business Club types, and media, and broadly what we call civil society. It's the EDSA constituency. They've had sort of veto power over corrupt and abusive presidents in the past. And I know from people who've spoken to Duterte that one of his fears is being overthrown by people power. That's been something that's always at the back of his mind. And so he's been trying to defang and delegitimize and basically cast doubt on the moral, which is the thing that Lala was talking about, cast doubt on the moral superiority of the church, of businessmen, of NGOs, of opposition politicians. Yeah.
So there are a couple of questions, kind of jumps back a little bit to, I think, Lilo's point about technocrats within the administration not wanting to borrow and so forth, and a couple of questions of that the administration has been borrowing at least some funds, but that not a lot of that money is translated into programs that would provide a safety net for communities that are negatively affected by the lockdown. I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
The problem here still is partly stemming from the Aquino administration, because they said if there's no corruption, there's no poverty, which actually, walang korap, walang hirap, which makes no economic sense. Because even if you take the entire money now, and the entire money pool that we have now, get rid of corruption, that still would not be enough to respond to the problems that have resulted from COVID. That wouldn't be enough to stimulate the economy. What we're looking at is, if you look at the rice bill, it's in the trillions. Even the most capable thief is not going to be able to steal in the trillions. That's the kind of money we need. So I know Filipinos, the problem with the Philippines is because of the trauma of the Marcos regime and because of the anti-corruption rhetoric of the Aquino administration. We become really, really austere, economically austere, meaning we hate debt, right? Because we think that any debt that we get will be stolen anyway. So the effect of that is that we become a kind of austerity state, and we become anti-stimulus. And in the era of COVID, that's not something that you should be concerned about. If you look at all the international newspapers, even the most conservative ones, or even like center-right ones, like The Economist, for example, it says that countries should not be concerned about debt at this point. Even Republicans say that you shouldn't be concerned with debt at this point. But because Filipinos are so austere in their thinking, they hear debt, they panic. Now, I have a friend, the former Undersecretary Jude Esguerra said, we're going to be in debt anyway. Because if you don't borrow, what's going to happen is that your tax base is going to collapse. You don't have a tax base, it collapses. You'll be in debt, but you didn't stimulate the economy. So there's a good way of being in debt, and that is you borrow now, you use that for stimulus, you have a tax base, and then you pay for that in the future. Because and the reason why you're able to pay for that in the future is because you fix things now.
Sheila, did you want to add anything?
No.
No. So a couple of questions here, kind of relating to China and the South China Sea. So do you see, is there any evidence that the South China Sea is actually a kind of salient issue for significant numbers of Filipinos in terms of the nationalist bona fides of Duterte, or is it more a concern of kind of the foreign policy elite and the military?
I think the China issue resonates among certain people, and unfortunately, among many Filipinos, it's this, anti-Chinese sort of racism that is coming out, and that certain sectors of the opposition somehow also unwittingly encourage. But certainly the nationalism, the kowtowing to China, especially in urban areas, especially in Manila, the resentment against this online gambling. People who go around the city don't integrate with the rest of the population, and are seen largely as being sort of just in the country to make a lot of money. That creates some resentment in the street, but whether that will be the defining issue against Duterte, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it is.
Liloy, did you want to chime in?
In the last SWS survey, I think the popularity of China actually dropped among Filipinos. So it was always negative, and it's becoming even more negative. And yet, that's not impacting Duterte's popularity. So I agree with Sheila, the relationship is not so clear.
So there was a follow-up question on terms of the opposition on the left, in terms of seeing, now that the far left, that the hard left is kind of out of the governing coalition. Do you see the ability to really forge a robust kind of broad opposition as happened in the early 80s, say under Marcos? Or is that just too disparate a coalition to hold together to really offer, a robust civil society defense, let alone an electoral alternative?
Yeah, that is a $1 billion question. I think it's going to be more difficult now than it was during the Marcos regime, only because the splits throughout most of the 1990s and the 2000s, there were various splits that occurred within the left, and these splits were very virulent. So these people trust each other less as compared to, say, the Marcos period. During the Marcos period, there was a lot of goodwill, for example, between the Liberal Party and the Communist Party, because Benigno Aquino Jr. was essentially, an ambassador of the Liberal Party towards the Communist Party, and even supplied them with arms. So that kind of goodwill doesn't exist now. Noynoy Aquino, for example, was a lot more anti-communist than his father. And so that mistrust exists now. And of course, the other element of mistrust comes from the fact that, of course, there are resentments from the fact that the CPP was essentially sympathetic to Duterte for the first 2-3 years of the administration.
Sheila, any thoughts on that?
Something always coalesces, and coalitions by nature are very fragile. So what we're seeing now, I think, if the military really wants to crush the communists, the anti-terror law and all of this oppression is really the wrong thing to do, because it is encouraging people towards more radical, towards radicalism and forms of action. And the Communist Party is one of the most organized remaining political parties. And so they stand to benefit from all of this. But at the same time, they're not that strong. They're weak, they're on the defensive, they're splintered and all of that. The liberal opposition has no real leader. Lenin Robredo seems to be reluctant to take on the leadership role, I think, at least this early. But at some point, things will come to a head. I expect that within 6 months, we'll have a better sense of what the anti-Duterte coalition would look like, who that would include, the kind of support that they have, and who their leader is going to be. I mean, right now, it's like the sands are shifting. Ground is shifting beneath our feet.
Yeah, I just want to add, just to add a little bit. This is unlike the 1980s or the 1970s, because 1970s and 1980s, above ground recruitment was expanding, but that came alongside an expansion of NPA troops. So from 2000 in the early 70s to around 20,000 in the late 80s, I don't get the sense that NPA guerrilla units are expanding, even though I suspect that the National Democratic Movement of the Communist Party is getting more recruits, or becoming, or essentially becoming more fashionable as a result of the fact that we're living in an authoritarian regime.
So we have a couple minutes left, and I was wondering if the two of you could just comment on, what do you think the lasting legacies of the Duterte administration are going to be? In the same way that we talk about now the Marcos era, when historians are looking 20 years out, is this administration going to be successful at having fundamentally altered, say, the political discourse in the Philippines by, with this particular type of authoritarian populism, with the erosion of democratic norms and attacks on dissent? Is this likely to be a long-term legacy of Duterte, or are we more likely to see a return to kind of elite democratic competition in the, after the next election?
Tough one. Lelo, you want to take a crack at that?
The only clue that I have that may help us in answering that question is the midterm, the 2018 midterm. If you look at what's happened here in the United States, clearly Trumpism will not die after Trump. You have people like Tom Cotton, for example, who want to become the next Trump, and you have people like Ron DeSantis who are imitating Trump, tapping into that constituency. In the 2018 election, the senatorial election, nobody ran on a Duterte-like platform. Nobody was really cursing. I mean, nobody was saying, I'm going to murder drug addicts, except for Bato de la Rosa, who is essentially, in the minds of Filipinos, the surrogate for Duterte, right? Even Bongo didn't run a Duterte-like campaign. So it seems to me that at least rhetorically, nobody's going to be able to copy Duterte. In that sense, Walden is correct that he's sui generis. That campaign strategy is not easily replicable. We also know, for example, that if you look at the numbers from Pulse Asia, Duterte was able to prime the drug problem. It suddenly shot up as a number one concern of the electorate. I don't know if somebody else is going to be able to do that, because even now, for example, the concern for drugs has already declined and everybody's more concerned with the economy. So, I'm not sure that Dutertismo will outlast Duterte, but I'm also not sure that it that it won't manifest in a different manner.
I think one of the lasting effects would be on the police, which has been empowered as an institution, just as we needed the military to go back to the barracks after the coup attempts of the 1980s. We need the police to go back to their camps and maybe be retrained on human rights. We were really, just as in the US, where, you know, our whole philosophy and practice of policing needs to be evaluated. And Duterte has shown us what a dysfunctional institution the Philippine police is. And we will, unless there are changes there will be a long-lasting effect in terms of corrupt, abusive, empowered police. The other long-lasting effects would be, you know, this use of social media astroturfing and disinformation that Duterte pioneered in is becoming a part of the toolkit for running presidential elections, and that certainly is going to outlast Duterte. I think the other thing that will outlast him is that will live on after him, and certainly he didn't start it, is the strong arm against the left, especially the above ground left. There will be continued pressure, not just on the CPP and the NDF, but on sort of people said to have to be progressive groups. And I mean, that hasn't changed. It's gone up and down since the Aquino era. I think we have to come to terms with the fact that it was Cory Aquino who first unleashed vigilantes in poor communities around the country to, you know, as a foil against the insurgency. The human rights toll of anti-insurgency campaigns will continue regardless of who becomes president. And unless you have, you know, a rethinking of the military and the police, that's going to happen. So a lot of the things were sort of what Duterte has done is to show us the flaws of our society in the starkest terms. He's sort of the maturation of all of these malevolent tendencies that have existed even before he became president. And so we're seeing that now. We're seeing, you know, all of these rotting leaves. We need to get at the roots. And unless we address those roots, what we see are the evils of Dutertismo, whatever you call it, will continue even in a liberal democratic regime.
Well, thank you both, Sheila and Liloy, for an incredibly interesting discussion. A reminder to folks that the recording will be available and people should feel free to share it. You can find it on our website, nysean.org. And on behalf of the Columbia School of Journalism, the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at Berkeley, NYU Wagner, and the New York Southeast Asia Network, thank you all very much for joining us today. Have a great day, everyone.